Hi, Sally. It's me again. Wednesday afternoon, 4 o'clock. Trying to call you.
It's kind of one of those unbelievable stories.
They actually researched how to conduct a silent death.
Hi, Sally. Where are you?
It kind of hit me. These two might have planned this.
When you step back from it, it's insane.
Sally, where are you? 5 o'clock. Wake up.
Greed, obsession, manipulation, dominance. There's a very evil seed at the beginning of this.
And I've got a problem with a neighbor over here who's screaming from next door.
Okay, what are they screaming?
He said, what are you doing? What are you doing? It sounded like a shot. I didn't know if it was a gunshot or what, but it sounded like there's somebody in the house. He's got his little 2-year-old daughter with him.
I'm working through a whole range of emotions. I'm going to this potentially deadly call. You have to kind of think on the fly because you don't know who's there, you don't know what's going on. All you have is a call as a shots fired.
As we're listening to the radio, there's a male who's been seen going inside the house with his daughter.
As a father, some of those things go through your mind of your family, your children, too. Like, we have to find the child. When I arrive, I'm hearing the struggle and the fight and the thumping that's going on upstairs. I don't know what's upstairs. I'm going up expecting to get into a gunfight. I can see blood splatter everywhere, bullets laying on the floor. There's a taser of some sort, and it's just chaos. I see a male with his back to me and a female who is bleeding profusely from her head. The male has a police-issued expandable baton in his hand. This is a domestic violence situation, and he's the aggressor.
The officers told the male to stop where he was. Unfortunately, he didn't stop where he was, at which point he was tased by one of our officers.
Once he was handcuffed, I still had to continue searching the hallways for the child and to make sure that we had no other victims. And then I can see down the hall and in the mirror, there was a reflection of a second female in the bedroom across the hall. It's a shock. When I got in there, she appeared fine, but these women are our victims. So I passed off the female to my cover unit, and then I continued down the hallway with another cover unit. And the 2-year-old was just standing in the middle of the bathroom and crying, like tremendously crying. We need to get to the bottom of what's going on. We take the child and the females outside so they can get whatever medical attention they needed.
We're able to identify the male suspect who was found in the hallway to be Eric Hill, and the female to be Eric's wife, Rosa Hill, and her mom, May Lee.
As deputies are escorting Eric out of the house to the rear of a patrol vehicle, his clothes were pulled in all sorts of directions. He was screaming as loud as he could. His face was red. He was sweating profusely.
Rosa and May were standing on the sidewalk, and May had some injuries on her face, and they had the baby there with them.
We determined that Eric Hill was living at the residence with his grandmother and his daughter. Eric and Rosa were going through a divorce, And there was a lot of custody battle issues between the two regarding their daughter.
I met Eric in the mid-90s. We were working together at a toy store. He'd come out here to California from Missouri, and I was living with his grandma for the time being. People would maybe take Eric for being less than he really is. And they would think that he was just a simple person, nothing to him, just a nerdy guy. But he had a look like he was sort of curious of the things around him, but very careful. Probably a look that's a little bit predator and a little bit prey. This divorce was very bitter, very nasty, and Eric had endured a lot of hardship and a lot of pain. The man at that point was completely broken down.
It was building up on him. He started having depression and anxiety, and they even had him on an antipsychotic at one point. That's where it really knew something was wrong.
I could see that he was pretty tired, but when I heard about what happened, it blew my mind. I couldn't believe that.
As I exited the house, Rosa and May were standing along that walkway with the baby, and they're kind of like lights on and no one's home, which is a physiological response that sometimes you can't control.
May had some serious injuries, so we give her some medical treatment.
Eric was in the back of a patrol vehicle in handcuffs. He was being frantic, and we're trying to sort out what happened. And then we learned some more details about his grandmother, Sally.
As a 90-year-old, she doesn't drive, she doesn't go out for walks, she doesn't stray too far from the home, but she was nowhere to be found in the residence.
For police, it's just as important to find Sally as it is to figure out what was going on between the three and the melee that police found at the Hill residence.
With Sally missing, we think we might have something a lot bigger than what we just walked into.
When Eric was working at Alameda County Social Services, he met with this woman named May. She was a bit of a social butterfly. She'd go around the workplace and people knew her. She was seen a lot, she was heard a lot, and she was well thought of. There was a hiking trip organized by May herself, and she invited Eric to go along. As luck would have it, May's daughter, Rosa, was on the trip, and they had a chance to meet each other and talk along the way. He seemed to like her just from the offset. He liked her look, her energy, and that's where his fascination with Rosa began. Rosa was an engineer in Silicon Valley, and he was really taken with her very logical, very analytical mind.
You know, it just all seemed to be folding around him, and since he didn't date a lot, it was just like, oh, this is great, you know, this is wonderful. I had hoped it would be too.
Eric is still in the back of a patrol vehicle. We're talking to Rosa and May on the sidewalk. May was still bleeding from the face.
They were withdrawn and not really sharing anything. Maybe it was because they had been assaulted and they're trying to figure stuff out. But I realized that because these two individuals have not been detained, they haven't been searched. Rosa's asked if she has any weapons on her, and she says no.
But to check all the boxes and to make sure that the baby's safe, there was a pat search that's done of Rosa.
We find that she does have something sizable in her pocket.
That's when the hair on the back of my neck really stood up.
you got to start asking more questions, right?
When our world just started to change.
The deputy reaches into Rosa's pocket and realizes it's a firearm.
Your heightened sense of security goes way up. It's a handgun. But just having the handgun itself doesn't make her the aggressor, because maybe she was defending herself.
We decided to do a pat search on May. And she's found to be in possession of a stun gun.
We have Rosa's mother, May, covered in blood. Eric attacking his own wife and mother-in-law. All three of them have weapons. And still, no one has seen Eric's grandmother, whose house is now a crime scene. The 2-year-old baby is removed from the scene, and Eric and May are taken to the hospital for their injuries.
We decide that we need to interview Rosa back at the police station.
Okay, Rosa. It's Rosa, correct?
Yes.
Okay, Rosa Lee.
During the interview with Rosa, she says that she came to Sally's house to meet with Eric to talk about custody issues that they had with their child.
It wasn't a divorce case to start with. He's on psychiatric medication, so I asked him to go seek help.
Was Eric there when you got there?
No, he wasn't.
What did you do when you got there?
When I got there, the garage door on the side was open. So I went in there and I didn't see anybody. I saw Eric's car pulling in. I guess he came in the house with the baby, and then the baby ran upstairs.
She said she was violently attacked by Eric in the house.
He pushed me and landed on top of me and started banging my head on the floor. And I thought for a minute, I thought I was about to pass out. And I think at that point, that's when my mom jumped in and tried to help me. At one point, I saw a gun in his hand, and I was afraid that he was going to shoot me. And I guess somehow he dropped it, and I picked it up, and I must have put it in my pocket because I don't remember how else.
What she is conveying lends credibility to being the victim. She appeared confident in her responses, but she was also very quiet, timid, scared of everything.
It was almost as though she was watching this happen and not really participating. I think she was dissociated with the entire situation.
The first time I saw Eric with Rosa, Eric looked different. He had gone on a special diet and he had lost a lot of weight. Never seen him look like that before. Whole nother new Eric, new look, new way about him. I was happy for him, but from the start, I was not real comfortable with the awkward silence that Rosa had.
When I first met her, I would ask her questions or try to get to know her, my son's girlfriend at the time. And she would whisper the answer in his ear. And finally I said, I'm not asking Eric the question, I'm asking you the question. I don't know what it was, but it's very strange to me.
Looking back on it, I recall the day that Eric invited me to attend his wedding. He had the look of a man who was kind of worried. It's a very unnatural sort of look. And I couldn't put my finger on it. I wasn't sure. It was something that did not seem right with this.
After medical treatment, May didn't want to talk. She was calm, but she was uncooperative just by the way she didn't want to give us a statement, didn't want to clarify what had occurred.
During the interview with Eric in the hospital, Eric was adamant that Sally didn't travel outside the house at all. She had no really mode of transportation to leave the house. So she should be there. She should be somewhere in the house. We did a secondary search of the residence, looking for where anybody could potentially be. We don't find anybody. So we went to the yard to see if we could find Sally or anything.
Walking through the exterior of the house, there's a backpack just placed near a wheelbarrow. That just seems odd.
It doesn't look like a backpack that Sally would be gardening with. The contents included rope, a crowbar, a knife, throwing star. My mind kind of went a little crazy on that one, trying to figure out, why is this here? What is this for? And who put it here? At the scene of this crime, we found 2 tasers, 2 stun guns, and 2 firearms.
The amount of weapons and the type of weapons that were found were really astonishing.
It is clear there is intent to harm. That really escalates the need to find Sally.
After their daughter was born, Rosa stopped working. And Eric was working 2 jobs. He was working his county job and he's working another job at night at a drugstore. He was pushing himself constantly. He was so distracted by keeping up with this pace to try and work, and it was never enough. Rosa would leave and she would go to her mother's house, May. As time went on, she was spending more and more time with her mother. The few times that I saw May and Rosa together, their energy was very tight and close together. They had this way about them like it was them against the world. But at that point, I simply didn't see Eric at all. He was simply not available.
It wasn't too much longer that the accusations were coming against Eric. Oh, I would get a call from a policeman. Has Eric ever had psychiatric problems? Is he overly depressed? Is he on psych meds? We were all getting the same feeling about something is wrong here.
So as we're gathering all this information, we have pretty much all the staff at Dublin Police there, because we know that time is of the essence, and Sally still hasn't been found.
Along the left side of the house, there was a shed, and it was locked. So initially, that wasn't searched.
We walked by this location a couple different times. It's missing now, but it was right here. One of our detectives was able to look through a little bit of a crack on the top of the shed, and he could see a garbage can that was inside. My heart dropped.
Our worst nightmares come to fruition.
We could see a human foot.
Once the coroner's office came out, we were able to remove the body from that garbage can. We take the sheets off, and we were able to confirm that's Sally.
This poor woman lived over 90 years just to be discarded like trash.
At that point, we were no longer dealing with an assault. It was clear that we were now dealing with murder.
During the interview with Rosa, she's all over the place.
Her timeline is changing. Her story continues to change. But one thing that doesn't change is that she's the victim in this.
And I remember me looking up and I saw my mom with blood on her face. I might have grabbed a taser to try to stop him.
I'm gonna tell you something else.
Okay.
Sally's dead. She's been murdered.
Okay.
No kidding? That's your reaction to that? She's been murdered. And she's stuffed in a garbage can in the back of the house.
She did not have any human response to it. No kidding.
To learn that your grandmother-in-law is dead and not to show any emotion towards it, I mean, one would think that you would be beside yourself. It was almost as though she didn't know who Sally was.
Hi, Sally. This is Les. 4 o'clock. Talk to you later. Hi, Sally. It's me again. Wednesday afternoon. 4:15.
Sally had a boyfriend named Lester, and they had a routine. Every afternoon at 4 p.m., Lester would call Sally on the phone, and they would have cocktail hour.
So on this particular evening, Les called at 4 o'clock, sharp, and Sally didn't pick up.
Hi, Sally. Where are you? Keep quiet. Trying to call you.
He's not used to her not answering. She's consistently answering at 4 o'clock. He's starting to get a little bit more worried.
Sally, where are you? Wake up. 5 o'clock.
Lester's so concerned that he calls his son Jeff, and Jeff and his wife go over to Sally's house. They're waiting outside until they see Eric and his daughter arrive home.
Oh, wow. My name is Eric Hill, and I am the ex-husband of Rosa Hill. It was just a normal day at work. You know, I finished my job, I picked up my daughter. When I got home, I saw some people standing out in front of the house. That scared me because I knew my grandmother was not in great health at this point. I was holding on to my daughter when I walked up the stairs. I went into my grandmother's room. I didn't see her. And then I heard a noise. And I turned around and I saw May. And I'm like, what are you doing here? And where's my grandmother? And she's like, I don't know. Last I saw her, she was downstairs. I set my daughter down. I ran out into the hallway. And as I did that, Rosa ran out of our daughter's room and shot me with a taser gun. And then that moment, May hit me over the head with like a metal baton. And that's when I realized, oh, they're trying to kill me.
Jeff and his wife are downstairs. They hear some screaming, and then they hear what sounds like a gunshot. They immediately run next door to the neighbor's house and call 911.
Honey, where's your thing?
And I've got a problem with a neighbor over here who's screaming from next door.
My head is just down in the carpet, and I'm seeing blood just start to drip into the rug. And I could hear my daughter crying. I guess they locked her in a bathroom. I was able to get myself up enough that I could fight one of them, but then the other one would knock me down. May had the baton, and she was pushing it down on my throat. And so I'm basically trying to hold with my hands to keep from choking. Rosa had a handgun. She cocked it and was holding it into my chest. And then May was just pleasantly talking to me. Are you gonna give up custody of the kid? Are you gonna give up custody? And I was really, really scared. And it was like, you better answer me. She will kill you. And I didn't want to die. I relented.
And yeah, I told him I'd give up custody. It was about this moment that I heard the police car outside.
Once we interview Eric, he admits to hitting May or Rosa to get them off of him. He doesn't call it back or soft shoe it or make it to a point where he's trying to justify his actions. He's just saying what happened.
At this point, the police were concerned about the fact that they had found these guns, that Eric had been injured, that neither Rosa nor May Lee had a connection, a legitimate connection to the home. They shouldn't have been there.
It was just flipped. These two women become our suspects and our aggressors in this scenario, and Eric was really the one fighting for his life.
Mother and daughter are now investigators' prime suspects in an assault and a homicide.
Rosa and May were both put into custody, and now it was just up to us to prove that they killed Sally. There was a lot of unanswered questions that we had. We're really trying to wrap our heads around,
Why Sally? What did Sally do to them?
Is she just an innocent bystander in this assault? Did she just get in the way?
We knew there had to be some more evidence out there that told us more of the story.
We're looking at timelines, we're looking at cell phone records, we're searching in residences for evidence.
I did a search on May and Rosa to see if there was any residence that was not identified yet that they've been receiving mail at.
We come across an additional address that looks like it belongs to May, and this address is in the city of Brentwood.
Just when you think the story can't get more bizarre, a secret location. And what cops are about to find is even crazier than anyone ever imagined.
Once we got there, we knew we hit the jackpot.
As we start to look around, we find things that were kind of weird. A punching bag, a pull-up bar.
It seemed like there was some exercise regimen that they were following.
We start looking even closer, and we find some items that are just mind-blowing. A samurai sword, definitely not something a normal household would keep just laying around the house. So this was also found at the Brentwood residence. There's so many different options of weapons that they could potentially use, and I think they were looking maybe for the right one.
You've got punching bags, swords, bows and arrows. When I saw the pictures, I had to laugh. The secret house looked like a military barrack. It appeared as though these women were getting ready for combat.
A short while after my daughter was born, the home situation was really falling apart. Whenever I'd come home and Rosa was there, it almost always ended in a fight. She knew how to manipulate me. She knew how to, push my buttons. So when my paycheck would come in, she would take the money out of the account and move it to other accounts, so I didn't have it. Finally, she wanted to separate, so she took our daughter and went to her parents' house. While I was at work, she changed the locks at our place. I wasn't able to get in, so I was out on the street. I was a mess, but luckily my grandmother was willing to give me a place to stay. It was only later that I started thinking it was May who was more orchestrating what was going on.
I believe that the ultimate brains of the situation was the mother, May. She's the one that had first contact with Eric. She's the one that sized him up. She was the predator. Eric was the prey all along.
I think it was a plan from the start. They wanted a child, they wanted a daughter particularly. And once they got that, then things started to turn.
He was just a tool. He was just a convenience for them to get what they wanted. I hate to say it, but I think that they probably looked at Eric as an overglorified sperm donor.
In addition to the weapons at the Brentwood home, we found a treasure trove of notes, to-do lists of how they needed to prepare for this event. There were references to revenge, lists of people that they believed did harm to them that should be dealt with. Specifically were listed Eric and Sally. We determined that more than one individual was responsible for writing those notes. They were attributable to both Rosa and to May.
I don't know if it's stupid or arrogant to leave that much evidence laying around.
They left a trail of breadcrumbs. I mean, it might have been just basically loaves of bread that they left for us.
Sally's autopsy comes in, and it reveals significant injuries. She had been tased. She had abrasions all over her body. She had head injuries. She had been asphyxiated. And the baton that we found on scene was likely utilized to choke her.
And then we did DNA testing on a taser that was located in the upstairs hallway. On the bar with the tasers was the DNA of Sally. On the cover of the taser, the DNA was Rosa Hill's.
So it was clear that she was a part of Sally's attack, and specifically the one who had tased Sally.
It's kind of a eye-opening moment. Like, you just kind of found that lone Easter egg that you've been looking for a while, right?
As our daughter was about to turn 1, I wanted to see her on her birthday. Rosa just flat up refused. That's when I got angry. I went and got a lawyer and started suing for custody. I wanted to see my kid, and I wanted my kid to know who I was. Rosa was competitive, and that became a challenge, and then it became a fight, and it was a big, ugly fight. She called the police and said that I was molesting our daughter.
Rosa and May, they did everything they could to destroy Eric. Destroy his name, destroy his reputation. It was a real smear campaign.
Rosa then told my job that I was becoming mentally unstable and was gonna go in and shoot the place up. They suspended me from my job, and then I got a call from the police that I was being investigated. They had pushed me to a point where, like, I was super exhausted. I could barely think straight. I was having psychotic breakdowns. And I think the idea was that I was just gonna die of a heart attack or just disappear. But as Rosa and I were going through the custody process, she was becoming argumentative and less cooperative. She couldn't keep her story straight over a long period of time. And all these accusations against me that led to her ultimately being investigated. And when that report was submitted, the judge was really upset with her. So I ended up getting 100% of the legal custody.
Losing custody enraged Rosa. She felt that she was losing to this man, who she saw as less than her.
They became, both of them, obsessed with the notion of getting the kid back at all costs. And they wanted to cut Eric off from his daughter for all time.
One of the things that we do when we do a search warrant is look for any electronics. We confiscated the computer that we found at the Brentwood home and did a forensic search.
We were taken back by some of the keyword searches that we were able to find. How to murder and get away with it.
How to break into a house.
How to kill somebody quietly.
Potions for poison. When you step back from it, it's insane.
They both felt they were very smart people. And of course, we found out how not smart they were. Shot themselves in the foot big time.
Given what they brought to the scene, the information that was contained in the notes and on those computers, a picture started to develop that both Rosa and May came up with what they called Operation Custody. This was a premeditated plan which required Sally to die.
KTVU was at the scene tonight. Selma Hill's body was found stuffed into a garbage can at her Dublin home. Rosa Hill and her mother, May Lee, now face life sentences for the murder.
While I'm in court, my nerves were just out of control. I was really scared about what would happen. I just remember seeing Rosa sitting at the table with a pad of paper and just frantically writing. And May is just sitting there smiling. The entire time, she's just sitting there smiling.
I've never had a case where there's been so much evidence of premeditation. Operation Custody ultimately was a plan devised by Rosa and May Lee to get custody back.
You couldn't script something like this. They were going to kill Sally and frame Eric for her murder.
They were going to take Eric from the home in leg irons and handcuffs and take him to another location and force a confession out of him, a suicide note that said that he had killed his grandmother because she had confronted him with molesting the child.
With Eric dead and the note left behind that he was a child molester, Rosa would be the only fit parent left to raise the child along with her mother.
Who does this? Who thinks like this? This is disgusting and it's sick and twisted.
It's hard to believe that this is real stuff that happened to me, and I only knew half of it. I didn't even get to see how much crazier it was than what I experienced.
An Alameda County judge today sentenced a mother and daughter to years in prison for killing a 91-year-old grandmother from Dublin.
When they announced that verdict, Rosa looked angry, and May did not change her demeanor. She had the same look, same smile. She did not change.
So they were able to take Mom out and dispose of her in a garbage can, upside down. It's horrible. I can hear my mom. I can hear her scream almost. I can hear what it would be like if she was screaming.
The sweet little old lady who had nothing but love for them, welcomed them into her home, into her family. She didn't matter to them. She did not matter at all.
You know, I often struggle with trying to figure out who is responsible for this plan. In the end, I figure it had to be both of them. That if there was just one person, then the other person would say, this is insane, we can't do this. But instead we have this folie à deux, the madness of two. Nobody was discouraging, it was always encouraging. We're Google together, we'll work out together, we'll go buy guns together, we'll do all these things together, and we'll kill together.
I hope they never get out. I just think we're all fortunate to have had Mom in our lives.
I think we enjoy those memories and try to focus on the positive and remember the good times.
I'm so proud of him as a father. The way he took hold and had to go through all this.
It's difficult being a single parent, but I did it. She's the motivation for me. She's also got an incredible sense of humor. And I do love to see her laugh, because I didn't for a long time. I just wanted her to know who I was. That's why I started trying to get some custody. And I don't regret that decision one bit. I just, did what I had to do.
This was a targeted execution.
She flew way out of the realm of normalcy.
There was rumors they were in an incestuous relationship.
Instead of going to bed in our bed, he'd go to bed in her bed.
It makes your mind explode.
No one remembers the exact moment the town stopped breathing. They only remember the silence afterward. It was a silence that settled over the cornfields like fog at dawn, thick and unmoving, pressing down on a place where nothing like this was ever supposed to happen. A silence that crept into kitchens and church pews, into the slow conversations at the gas station, into the eyes of people who had known each other their entire lives. A silence born the morning they found the car. It sat at the edge of County Road E18, half swallowed by tall grass, driver's door slightly open, as if someone had stepped out for just a second and never returned. The engine was cold. The keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat, a folded road map, creased and worn, marked with a circle in red ink. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just absence. Just the hollow outline of a life that had been there hours before. This was Iowa. Small-town Iowa. The kind of place where headlines came from high school football scores and church bake sales, not police tape and flashing light. And yet by noon, the word missing had spread faster than the sheriff could control it. By nightfall, the word had changed. It always does. Cold case. The missing woman was 27 years old. Her name was spoken softly at first, as if saying it too loudly might make it permanent. She had grown up 3 streets away from where she disappeared. Graduated from the same high school as her parents. Waitressed at the diner off Main Street where everyone knew how she took her coffee. She was the kind of person who waved at strangers, the kind of person people noticed when she wasn't there. Her last confirmed sighting was just after 9 p.m., walking out of the diner with a paper bag in her hand, smiling at a regular who teased her about working too hard. She said she was heading home. She never arrived. By sunrise, volunteers lined the roads. Farmers parked their trucks and joined the search. Deputies walked the fields in straight lines, eyes scanning the ground for anything that didn't belong. A shoe. A purse. A sign that this wasn't just a bad dream. They found nothing. Inside her abandoned car, investigators noted details that felt wrong in ways they couldn't yet explain. Her purse was missing, but her wallet wasn't. Her phone was gone, but her jacket was folded neatly in the back seat. There were no fingerprints they could use, no footprints in the dirt that told a clear story. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The sheriff stood in front of cameras that afternoon, his voice steady but his eyes betraying him. He spoke about an ongoing investigation. He asked for patience. He asked for tip. He avoided the word everyone else was already using. Cold case. But the town didn't need permission. They felt it in their bones. This wasn't going to be quick. This wasn't going to be easy. And whatever had happened on that dark stretch of road had left behind more questions than answers. Rumors filled the vacuum almost immediately. Some said she had run away, though no one could explain why. Others whispered about a boyfriend, an argument, a secret no one had known. A few pointed toward the highway, toward the idea of a stranger passing through, a faceless evil that could disappear as easily as it arrived. Investigators followed every lead until the leads began to circle back on themselves. They interviewed friends, co-workers, ex-lovers. They searched her apartment, her internet history, her bank records. Nothing suggested she had planned to vanish. Nothing suggested she was alive. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The case file grew thicker even as the trail went cold. Photos faded. Witness memories blurred. Detectives retired. New ones took their place, reading reports written by men who were now dead, trying to hear urgency in words typed decades earlier. And still no body. No confession. No arrest. In the town, life resumed its shape, but it never fully returned to normal. Parents walked their children to school longer than they used to. Doors stayed locked. Every unfamiliar car was watched just a little too closely. The diner kept her seat empty for weeks, then quietly filled it again, though some swore the air there never felt the same. Each anniversary brought fresh pain. Candles, vigils, newspaper articles that asked the same questions with fewer words each year. Where is she? What happened? Will we ever know? Then, decades later, everything changed. A press release appeared without warning, short and clinical, its language careful but explosive. The words spread faster than the original disappearance ever had. Phones buzzed. Television crews returned. Reporters stood in the same spots they had stood years ago, older now, reading from scripts that felt unreal. Small-town Iowa cold case closed. Killer revealed decades later. The town held its breath again, just like it had all those years ago, waiting to find out if the silence was finally about to break, or if it was about to deepen into something even more unsettling. And beneath the relief, beneath the shock, one question lingered, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What if the truth wasn't as simple as the headline promised? The relief didn't come all at once. It never does. It crept in slowly, cautiously, like someone stepping onto thin ice, afraid the surface might crack. At first, people didn't celebrate. They reread the headline again and again, letting the words sink in. Cold case closed. Killer revealed. Decades later. It sounded definitive, clean, final. Too clean, some thought, for a mystery that had lived this long and refused to die quietly. The name came next. An elderly man. 78 years old. White hair. Fading eyes. A former resident who had left town years after the disappearance and never looked back. The press release called him a person of interest turned suspect, a phrase that suggested a neat transformation, as if suspicion had simply matured into certainty over time. He had died 3 months earlier in another state, of natural causes, alone in a small apartment. No trial. No confrontation. No chance for questions. Authorities said new forensic analysis had tied him to the scene. Fibers. Soil samples. A partial DNA profile recovered from material preserved decades ago, tested with technology that didn't exist when the case first went cold. The science sounded impressive, reassuring. Modern answers for an old nightmare. But for people who had lived with the questions for half a lifetime, the announcement felt less like closure and more like another disturbance of the wound. Because the name wasn't unfamiliar. Some remembered him clearly, others vaguely. He had been around back then, not close, not family, but present enough to register. He'd worked odd jobs, drank at the same bar, nodded at the same people. He was described in old yearbooks as quiet, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The kind of man who blended into the background of a small town without ever quite belonging to it. In the days following the announcement, reporters dug into archived photographs, pulling his face into the light. Grainy images appeared on screens. A younger man standing at the edge of group photos, his expression unreadable, his eyes giving nothing away. Commentators speculated about what had been hidden behind that look all those years. The sheriff's department held a press conference in the same building where the original search had been coordinated. The walls were repainted. The chairs were new. But the air felt familiar, heavy. They spoke about evidence, about diligence, about justice delayed but not denied. They assured the public there was no longer any danger. They used the word closure repeatedly, as if saying it enough times could make it true. Yet as the cameras rolled, something subtle but unmistakable passed through the crowd. Not relief, not satisfaction, unease. Because questions remained. And not small ones. The forensic link, when examined closely, wasn't as ironclad as the headline suggested. The DNA profile was partial, degraded, consistent, investigators said, but not exclusive. The fibers matched materials common to hundreds of vehicles from that era. The soil composition could be found across miles of rural roadway. Individually, each piece was explainable. Together, they formed a narrative. But narratives are not fact. They are interpretations. And there was the confession. Or rather, the absence of one. The suspect had never admitted to anything. No recorded statements. No letters. No deathbed revelations. He had denied involvement when briefly questioned decades earlier, and he had never been interviewed again. The case, it seemed, had not been solved by a sudden breakthrough, but assembled retrospectively, built backward from a conclusion reached after the suspect could no longer speak for himself. Some saw that as poetic justice. Others saw it as convenient. In the town, conversations shifted. At the grocery store. At church. In the quiet moments when people felt safe enough to say what they really thought. There was gratitude, yes. Gratitude that the story might finally have an ending. But there was also doubt. A nagging sense that something had been skipped over, smoothed out, explained away too quickly. Because there were things that had never fit. Details from the original investigation that didn't align neatly with the newly revealed suspect. Witness statements that pointed in other directions. Sightings that contradicted the official timeline. Back then, several people had reported seeing her car earlier that evening, parked not on County Road E18, but closer to town, near the edge of a gravel lot behind a closed hardware store. One witness had described a man standing near the driver's side, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a jacket that didn't match anything later associated with the suspect. That lead had been dismissed after inconsistencies in the witness's account were found. Memory is fragile, investigators said. Stress distorts perception. Another witness claimed to have received a strange phone call days after the disappearance. A woman breathing heavily on the line, saying nothing, then hanging up. The call had been traced to a payphone miles away, but no one was ever identified. The detail faded into the background noise of the case, mentioned less and less as years passed. And then there was the map. The folded road map found in her car, marked with a red circle. At the time, it had been considered insignificant. A travel plan. A reminder. But the circled area wasn't on the route to her home. It wasn't even close. It pointed toward an isolated stretch of land near an old quarry, a place locals avoided, a place that had been searched extensively with no results. After that initial search turned up nothing, the map was filed away and rarely mentioned again. The new suspect had no documented connection to that area. As reporters began to re-examine these loose ends, the narrative started to strain. Officials responded by emphasizing the totality of the evidence, the big picture. They urged the public not to fixate on anomalies. Cold cases, they reminded everyone, are messy by nature. Still, for the family, the announcement brought something else entirely. Her parents had aged in public. Their grief had been chronicled in annual interviews, their hope flickering and dimming but never fully extinguishing. When they stood before microphones again, they thanked law enforcement. They spoke about peace. They said they could finally sleep. But when the cameras stopped rolling, Those closest to them noticed something different. A distance, a restraint, as if accepting this version of the truth required letting go of questions they weren't ready to abandon. Because even now there was no body, no place to mourn, no remains to bury, no physical confirmation that what authorities claimed had truly happened. The story ended on paper, but not in reality, not in a way that silenced the doubts. Years earlier, an investigator had written a note in the margin of the case file. Just a sentence, almost lost among reports and transcripts. If we're wrong about this, we may never know. At the time, it had meant nothing. Now it felt prophetic. As the media cycle moved on and the headlines faded, the town was left once again with its thoughts. With the cornfields, with the roads that stretched into darkness, with the uneasy awareness that a mystery declared solved doesn't always stay that way. Because closing a cold case doesn't erase the cold. And somewhere beneath the official conclusion, beneath the tidy explanation offered decades too late, the unanswered questions continued to breathe, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to notice that the story still didn't add up. The silence returned. But this time it felt different, heavier, charged. As if the truth, whatever it was, had just slipped a little further out of reach. Time didn't heal the town. It reorganized it. After the announcement, after the cameras left and the officials stopped returning calls, the case settled into a strange new phase. Not open, not truly closed, but suspended in an official version of events that felt heavier than uncertainty ever had. People tried to move on, because that's what small towns do when there's nowhere else to go, but the story refused to stay quiet. It resurfaced in fragments, in arguments, in half-finished sentences that ended with someone shaking their head and saying, "It still doesn't make sense." The first crack appeared in the record. A local reporter, younger than the case itself, requested access to the original evidence logs under an open records request. She expected routine delays, missing files, the usual erosion of time. What she didn't expect was inconsistency. Items logged with dates that didn't align. Evidence marked as processed before it was officially collected. A box labeled with the wrong year, containing photographs she had never seen published before. Among them was a picture of the car, taken not where it was officially found, but somewhere else entirely. The angle was wrong. The background didn't match County Road E18. The tree line was closer. The ground flatter. When she showed it to a retired deputy who had worked the case in its first year, he stared at it for a long time before speaking. "That was earlier," he said. "Before we moved it." Moved it. The word landed wrong. According to official timelines, the car had been discovered once, photographed, processed, and towed. No mention of relocation. No reason given for disturbing a potential crime scene beyond standard procedure. But the photograph suggested something else, that the vehicle had been found, examined briefly, and then repositioned, possibly before state investigators arrived. When pressed, the department's response was vague. Procedures were different back then. Documentation standards had evolved. Memories faded. No wrongdoing implied. But that explanation didn't account for what came next. Buried in the same box was a handwritten note, unsigned, its paper yellowed and brittle. It referenced an item recovered from the trunk that had never been entered into evidence. The note didn't describe it in detail, only hinted at its nature. Personal. Could complicate narrative. Advise hold. The item was never mentioned again. As word of these discoveries spread quietly through the town, old conversations reopened. People who had stayed silent for years began to speak again, cautiously at first, then with growing urgency. Not to reporters. To each other. In kitchens. On back porches. Places where trust still mattered. One name surfaced repeatedly, not as an accusation, but as a question. A man who had been close to the investigation early on. Not a suspect. Not a witness. Someone adjacent to authority. Someone whose presence at key moments had been noted but never explained. He had since moved away, retired comfortably, died quietly. No one accused him outright. They didn't have to. The pattern spoke for itself. He had been the one to suggest the quarry search be scaled back early, citing lack of evidence. He had been present when the car was processed. He had signed off on the dismissal of the payphone call lead. Coincidence, officials said. Experience, others countered. The problem with cold cases isn't always what's missing. It's what's been smoothed over, compressed into something easier to live with. And then there was the timeline. The official version placed her disappearance within a narrow window, less than 30 minutes between leaving the diner and the estimated time her car was abandoned. But that window relied on assumptions, not fact. No one actually saw her drive toward County Road E18. No traffic cameras existed then. The timeline had been constructed to fit the discovery, not the other way around. Years later, a former co-worker came forward with something that had never made it into the file. On the night she vanished, the co-worker claimed she hadn't gone straight to her car. She had lingered by the phone near the back of the diner, arguing with someone quietly, urgently. The co-worker hadn't thought much of it at the time. Couples fought. People had bad days. But the detail mattered now. Because the call logs from that diner phone had been destroyed within months of the disappearance, deemed irrelevant after investigators concluded she had left alone. No effort had been made to retrieve records from the phone company. Another choice. Another closed door. The newly revealed suspect didn't fit this emerging picture. His whereabouts that night were never firmly established, but neither were they tied to the diner, the phone call, or the map. The case against him was circumstantial, built from fragments that could point in many directions. And yet, he had been selected as the ending. Some suggested the truth was simpler than the doubts implied. That after decades of pressure, after generations of unanswered questions, the department needed resolution. A name. A face. Someone who could no longer challenge the conclusion. Justice, redefined as closure. The family stayed mostly silent during this period, declining interview requests, avoiding public comment. Privately, they wrestled with something far more difficult than doubt, choice. To accept the official story and find peace, or to reopen a wound that had never truly closed. Her mother kept the map. It had been returned years earlier, along with other personal effects, after investigators declared they no longer needed them. She had never thrown it away. The red circle had faded, but it was still visible, still deliberate. One evening, decades after the disappearance, she drove to the circled location alone. The quarry had changed, partially filled, overgrown, but some features remained. A narrow service road, a clearing shielded from the main path, a place where a car could be hidden briefly without being seen from a distance. She didn't find remains. She didn't expect to. What she found was something smaller, easier to miss. A rusted piece of metal, half buried near the edge of the clearing. A broken keychain clasp, identical to one her daughter had used. Cheap. Common. Impossible to definitively identify. But it was enough to reopen everything. She turned it over to authorities. They thanked her. Logged it. Filed it away. No public update followed. By then, the story had already been written. The cold case was closed. The killer revealed. The town could finally rest. Except it couldn't. Because the more people looked, the more the edges frayed. Because each answer generated new questions. Because truth doesn't always align with resolution. Late one night, the reporter who had started digging received an anonymous message. No name. No explanation. Just a scanned image of a document she had never seen before. A transfer request, dated 2 weeks after the disappearance, requesting the temporary reassignment of a vehicle, not hers but another, to a private facility outside town. The reason listed was a single word. Containment. The sender never followed up. The number couldn't be traced. But the implication lingered. That there had been more vehicles, more scenes, more decisions made quietly, away from the search parties and the press conferences. That the story everyone had been told was not the full one. As the town slept, the case breathed again, not as an open investigation, not as a closed chapter, but as something in between, a truth displaced, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And somewhere in the dark, beneath decades of paperwork and carefully chosen conclusions, the past shifted slightly, as if reminding those who listened closely that it was never finished telling its story. Just buried. Waiting. The problem with buried things is that they don't stay buried forever. Pressure builds. Soil shift. Time, relentless and patient, does its work. And when the past finally pushes its way back to the surface, it rarely does so cleanly. It comes back distorted, incomplete, carrying the weight of everything that was placed on top of it to keep it quiet. The reporter didn't publish the document right away. She couldn't. One scanned page, anonymously sent, wasn't proof of anything on its own. But it changed how she read the case, how she read every report, every omission. It reframed the disappearance not as a single moment of violence, but as a series of decisions made afterward. Containment. The word echoed through her notes, through the transcripts she reread late into the night. Containment implied risk. Damage control. Something that needed to be managed rather than solved. It suggested that the danger wasn't only what had happened to the missing woman, but what could happen if the full truth escaped. She went back to the evidence logs again, this time looking not for what was present, but for what was conspicuously absent. Vehicles seized, then released without explanation. Clothing described in early interviews but never photographed. A length of rope mentioned once, then never again. Each absence felt intentional in its own quiet way. The deeper she looked, the clearer the pattern became. Early in the investigation, the focus had shifted rapidly away from anyone local. The possibility of a crime committed by someone within the town had been downplayed almost immediately, replaced by theories of a transient offender, a stranger passing through. It had been easier that way. Safer. No need to question neighbors. No need to fracture trust. The stranger theory didn't come from nowhere, but it gained traction far faster than the evidence justified. Tips pointing inward were deprioritized. Tips pointing outward were amplified. The narrative narrowed, not because it was accurate, but because it was survivable. In the first month after the disappearance, one tip had come in repeatedly, from different callers, all describing the same thing. A second vehicle seen near her car late that night. A dark sedan. Parked at an angle that suggested urgency, not coincidence. Witnesses disagreed on details. Color, exact model, but they agreed it didn't belong there. That lead had been logged, then quietly closed. The justification, according to an internal memo, was that the sightings were likely related to search activity. The problem was timing. Some of the calls described the vehicle before the search began. When confronted with this discrepancy decades later, officials shrugged. Memory contamination, they said. People misremember. Stories merge. Except the callers hadn't known each other. The reporter traced one of them down, an elderly man living 2 counties away, surprised to be contacted after all these years. His memory was sharp where it mattered. He remembered the fear. The certainty that what he was seeing was wrong. I turned around because I thought someone needed help, he said. But then I saw the way it was parked. Like they didn't plan to be there long. He hadn't stopped. He'd gone home. Called it in the next morning. And then, nothing. No follow-up. No questions. There was another call that night too, one that never made it into the official summary. A woman reported hearing shouting near the quarry shortly after midnight. Not screaming. Raised voices. Anger. The call was logged as unverified noise complaint and routed away from the investigative team. Why? Because by then, the quarry had already been deprioritized. The search there had been public, intense, and brief. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers. When nothing turned up, it became a symbol of failure, a place investigators wanted to move past quickly. Admitting they might have missed something would have meant reopening an area already declared cleared. And reopening meant admitting mistakes. Mistakes multiplied when time was involved. In the weeks following the disappearance, a vehicle matching the general description of the second car was towed from a private property just outside town. It belonged to a man connected, distantly but undeniably, to the investigation. Not a lead, not a suspect, just someone with access. The tow was logged as unrelated. The vehicle was returned within 48 hours. No forensic analysis recorded. That detail surfaced only because the reporter cross-referenced towing company records with police logs, two systems that had never been designed to talk to each other. When she asked the department for comment, the response was immediate and defensive. The vehicle had no relevance, they said. Revisiting these details served no purpose. The case was closed. Closed cases, she learned, are protected fiercely. As she worked, resistance increased. Sources went silent. Emails went unanswered. One afternoon, she returned to her car to find the passenger door slightly ajar. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. The message was subtle but clear. This story had boundaries. Meanwhile, in the town, the effects of the renewed scrutiny were impossible to ignore. Old relationships strained under the weight of implication. People revisited their own memories, wondering what they had seen, what they had dismissed, what they had chosen not to ask. Some felt anger, not at the supposed killer named in the press release, but at the idea that the truth had been curated, shaped to protect something larger than justice. Others felt fear. Because if the Real story involved someone powerful enough to steer an investigation, then no one had ever truly been safe. The family watched all of this from a distance. Her father, long since tired of public hope, spoke once, quietly, to a friend. He said he didn't know what had happened to his daughter, but he knew what hadn't. She hadn't simply vanished. She hadn't trusted easily. She wouldn't have gotten into a stranger's car without a reason. He believed that reason had been local. A request. A familiar face. Someone who didn't raise alarms until it was too late. Late one evening, as the reporter pieced together her draft, she noticed something that stopped her cold. A name repeated across documents in different contexts, not as a suspect, not as a witness, but as an approving signature. A person whose role bridged multiple agencies. Someone who had been in a position to shape decisions quietly. The name had never appeared in any article. It hadn't needed to. Power rarely announces itself. She searched public records, obituaries, archived newsletters. The man had been praised for his service, awarded for leadership. He had lived out his life respected, unchallenged. And then she found it. A photograph from a charity event, taken years after the disappearance. In the background, barely noticeable, was a car. A dark sedan. Parked at an angle that mirrored witness descriptions almost exactly. The license plate was partially visible. Enough to match an old towing record. Enough to raise a question no one had asked publicly before. What if the case hadn't gone cold because there were no answers? What if it had been cooled deliberately? The reporter stared at the image, understanding the risk, the consequences, the potential fallout. Publishing this wouldn't just reopen a case. It would reopen a town. It would force people to confront not just a crime, but the possibility of collective denial. She saved the file, closed her laptop. Outside, the road stretched into darkness, quiet and familiar. The same roads that had carried search parties, police cruisers, and eventually, silence. Somewhere along those roads, the truth still lingered, not lost, not gone, just waiting for the moment when it could no longer be contained. And that moment, after decades of restraint, was drawing dangerously close. The night the reporter decided to publish, the town slept the way it always had, unaware, trusting, convinced that whatever darkness once passed through had already moved on. She didn't sleep. She sat at her desk long after midnight, rereading every line, every quote, every document, aware that once the story went live there would be no pulling it back. This wasn't a theory piece. It wasn't speculation. It was a reconstruction of choices, of what had been pursued, what had been dismissed, and what had been quietly redirected until only one outcome remained acceptable. She opened with the headline everyone thought they already understood. Small-town Iowa cold case closed. Killer revealed decades later. Then she dismantled it. She wrote about the inconsistencies first, carefully, methodically. The relocated vehicle, the missing evidence, the unexplained tow. She avoided conclusions, letting the facts sit uncomfortably beside each other. She named no new suspects. She didn't have to. The story wasn't about who had done it, not yet. It was about how the truth had been handled. By morning, the article had spread beyond the town limit. State outlets picked it up, then national ones. Comment sections filled with familiar patterns: outrage, skepticism, disbelief. Some accused her of exploiting tragedy. Others praised her courage. A few, quieter but more chilling, warned her to be careful. The department issued a statement within hours. It called the article misleading. It reaffirmed confidence in the original conclusion. It reminded the public that the named suspect had been linked through forensic evidence, and that reopening the case would serve no purpose. That phrase again. No purpose. But the town felt otherwise. By noon, people were talking openly. Not in whispers this time. In raised voices at the diner. In long phone calls to relatives who had left years ago but never quite let go. The article gave language to doubts that had lived unspoken for decades. It validated instincts people had been told to ignore. And it did something else. It brought new witnesses forward. The first was a man in his early 60s who had never spoken publicly about the night she disappeared. He'd been younger then, reckless, driving roads he shouldn't have been on at hours he couldn't explain to anyone. He told the reporter he had seen something he didn't understand at the time. A car pulled over near the quarry, hazard lights off, trunk open. A man stood beside it, arguing with someone inside the vehicle. He hadn't stopped. He was afraid. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of becoming involved. He recognized the man years later, not from the press release, but from the photograph in the article, the one taken at the charity event. "I know faces," he said. That was him. The second call came from farther away, from a woman who had been a teenager then, living on a farm outside town. She remembered hearing a car speed down the gravel road behind her house late that night, faster than anyone ever drove there. She remembered headlights cutting across her bedroom wall, stopping briefly, then moving on. She had told her father the next morning. He told her to forget it. Nothing good came from stirring things up. She never forgot. These accounts didn't fit neatly into the closed case narrative. They didn't support the idea of a lone offender acting unseen. They suggested urgency, movement, a situation unfolding in real time, involving someone confident enough to act without fear of consequence. Authorities dismissed the new statements as unreliable, citing the passage of time, memory degradation, influence from media coverage. But something had shifted. The family requested a meeting. Not with the local department, but with the state attorney general's office. They brought with them the map, the keychain clasp, copies of the article. They asked for an independent review. Not justice, not punishment, just clarity. The request was acknowledged, not granted, not denied. Under review. Behind closed doors, conversations grew tense. The case had become radioactive. Reopening it meant admitting that the celebrated closure might be flawed. It meant scrutiny not just of evidence, but of careers, reputations, legacies. The man whose name hovered over the documents, the signatures, the approvals, he could no longer defend himself. But others could and did. They argued that decisions had been made in good faith, that hindsight distorted reality, that tearing open old wounds would harm the community. Harm, it seemed, was a matter of perspective. Late one evening, the reporter received another message. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It was from a former officer, long retired, who had worked the case briefly before being transferred unexpectedly. "I was told to stop asking questions," the message read. "I didn't understand why back then. I think I do now." They met in a neutral place, far from town. He spoke carefully, choosing words like someone who had practiced silence for years. He described pressure. Not threats exactly. More like guidance. Suggestions about which leads were worth time and which were distractions. He remembered pushing to re-interview a local figure whose timeline didn't add up. The next week, he was reassigned. "I thought I'd messed up," he said. "That I didn't know how things worked yet." He never went back to the case. The interview ended without dramatic. No smoking gun. No confession. Just another piece sliding into a picture that was becoming impossible to ignore. By the time autumn arrived, the town was divided in a way it hadn't been even in the days after the disappearance. Not between guilt and innocence, but between those who wanted the past left alone and those who could no longer accept a convenient ending. The cold case was closed on paper. In reality, it was unraveling. And as the pressure mounted, as attention returned to roads and fields long considered irrelevant, one question pressed harder than all the others. If the wrong man had been named as the killer, then who had the truth been protecting all along? The answer, still unspoken, lingered just beyond reach, close enough now to feel, heavy enough to threaten everything the town thought it knew about itself. And the closer it came, the clearer it became that this story was never about solving a crime. It was about surviving the solution. The review, when it finally came, didn't arrive with sirens or announcements. It arrived as a letter, formal, restrained, heavy with legal language that promised everything and nothing at the same time. An independent assessment would be conducted. Scope to be determined. Findings to be reported internally before any public statement. It was enough to reignite the fire. Not enough to control it. State investigators began quietly. No uniforms. No press. They pulled files that hadn't been touched in years, dust rising from cardboard boxes sealed before some of them were born. They spoke to people the original investigation had waved away. They asked questions that hadn't been asked because the answers were inconvenient. And almost immediately the past resisted. Documents were missing. Not lost, not misplaced, gone. Pages torn cleanly from binders. Audio tapes degraded beyond recovery, their labels still legible, mocking in their clarity. One investigator remarked that it felt less like reviewing an old case and more like excavating a site that had already been looted. Still, patterns emerged. The same names, the same approvals, the same decisions repeated across different moments, always tilting the investigation away from certain paths and toward others. Not blatant, not illegal, just enough to steer. One investigator summarized it quietly to a colleague late one night. "No single lie," he said. "Just 1,000 small truths arranged in the wrong order." They revisited the early interviews. Transcripts revealed subtle shifts between initial statements and later summaries. Hesitations cleaned up. Uncertainty replaced with confidence. A witness who had said "I think" became "I'm sure." Another who had said "I didn't recognize him" was recorded as "no identification made," a small but crucial difference. Memory reshape. They tracked down the towing records again. This time, they found something the reporter hadn't. A handwritten receipt attached to the file, authorizing after-hours access to the impound lot on the night the second vehicle was held. The signature was familiar. Authorization without oversight. That vehicle, they learned, had been cleaned. Not detailed. Clean. Interior vacuumed. Surfaces wiped. Standard procedure, according to the facility. Except evidence vehicles weren't supposed to be touched at all until cleared. No one could say who ordered it. No one could say why. The investigators returned to the quarry. Time had altered it further. Erosion, vegetation, new dumping. But they weren't looking for remains anymore. They were looking for confirmation, signs that something had happened there, even briefly. Tire impressions preserved beneath layers of gravel. Metal fragments inconsistent with the area. Anything that suggested movement, not stasis. They found traces. Not enough to rewrite history, but enough to challenge it. Tire marks that didn't match the victim's car. Impressions consistent with a heavier vehicle. A place where gravel had been disturbed and then re-smoothed by machinery. Someone had been careful. Back in town, the reaction to the review was complicated. Some felt vindicated. Others felt exposed. The story was no longer abstract. It had names now. Roles. Responsibilities. People realized that the past they'd been living alongside wasn't passive, it had been actively shaped. The man whose shadow hung over the case remained officially unmentioned. But his presence was everywhere. In the margins. In the approvals. In the quiet confidence with which decisions had been made. Those who had worked under him remembered things differently now. Moments that had seemed routine took on new weight. A suggestion framed as advice. A warning disguised as mentorship. One former subordinate admitted, off record, that he'd been told explicitly not to pursue a lead involving a local figure. The reason given was political sensitivity. The town couldn't afford scandal, he'd been told. Not then. Not ever. The town, it seemed, had been treated like evidence. Something to be protected, preserved, controlled. As the review progressed, pressure mounted from unexpected places. Funding delays, jurisdictional disputes, anonymous complaints about investigator conduct. Nothing overt, just enough friction to slow momentum. The reporter felt it too. Her editor received calls questioning her credibility. Old articles were scrutinized, mistakes inflated. A lawsuit was hinted at, never filed. She kept working anyway, aware that stories like this had a way of punishing persistence. Then, late one afternoon, she received a call that changed the tone entirely. A lab technician, recently retired. He had handled evidence in the case decades earlier. He hadn't spoken up before because he hadn't realized the significance of what he'd seen, not until now. He remembered processing an item that wasn't in the logs. A piece of fabric, dark, heavy, not from the victim's clothing. He'd tagged it, set it aside, and later found it gone. When he asked about it, he was told it had been misidentified and discarded. He hadn't questioned it. Now he did. The description matched something else in the file, a jacket described by early witnesses, never officially recovered. The one that didn't match the suspect named decades later. The one associated with a man people had seen near the quarry. The implications rippled outward. If evidence had been removed, then the case hadn't simply been misinterpreted. It had been altered. That distinction mattered. The investigators compiled their preliminary findings. They stopped short of conclusions, but the tone was unmistakable. The closure announcement, they wrote, had overstated certainty. The forensic links were weaker than presented. The possibility of investigative interference could not be ruled out. They recommended further action. The recommendation was never made public. Instead, a statement was issued. It acknowledged procedural irregularities, while reaffirming confidence in the overall outcome. The cold case, it said, remained closed. The town read it in silence. For some, it was the final insult. For others, a relief. Because reopening the case fully would mean confronting a truth that implicated not just one man, but a system, a community, a collective decision to look away. That night, the reporter stood at the edge of the quarry again, recording audio notes into her phone. Wind moved through the tall grass, carrying sounds that could have been voices if she let her imagination go that far. She didn't. She focused on what could be proven, what could be shown, what could not be erased, no matter how carefully it had been managed. Somewhere between the official statements and the evidence that refused to disappear, The real story waited, fragile, incomplete, but stubbornly alive. And for the first time in decades, it felt closer than ever to breaking free. Not because someone confessed, but because too many people were finally listening. By the time winter settled in, the town no longer argued about what had happened. It argued about what it meant. Snow softened the edges of the roads, covered the fields where search lines had once stretched shoulder to shoulder. It made everything look cleaner, quieter, as if the land itself were trying to forget. But forgetting was no longer an option. Not after the review. Not after the article. Not after the realization that the truth, whatever shape it took, had been deliberately bent. People began to remember things they hadn't trusted themselves to remember before. A mechanic recalled a car brought into his shop late one night, years ago, with damage that didn't match the explanation given. A dent along the rear panel. Scratches near the trunk latch. He'd asked questions. He'd been told it was nothing. The customer had flashed a badge, not aggressively, just long enough to end the conversation. A bartender remembered a man drinking alone the night after the disappearance, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the glass. He'd left a tip too large to be casual. The bartender hadn't known why the memory stayed with him. Now he did. None of these recollections were definitive. On their own, they were just fragments. But fragments were what this case was built from. Fragments, carefully arranged to point away from the uncomfortable center. The investigators felt it too. The sense that they were circling something solid, something just out of reach. They revisited the suspect named in the closure announcement, not to relitigate guilt, but to understand why he had been chosen. His connection to the case, it turned out, was thin but convenient. He had been present in town. He had left shortly afterward. He had no close family to object loudly. No local allies. No one to defend his name with influence. When new forensic tools became available, his profile was close enough to justify certainty in public, even if privately it raised doubts. He was the path of least resistance. The investigators didn't say that out loud. They didn't need to. It was there in the way files had been assembled, in how emphasis had shifted over time. The case hadn't been solved. It had been settled. Meanwhile, the name that never appeared on paper continued to surface in conversation, always indirectly. People spoke around it, careful, as if saying it too clearly might summon consequences even now. Power, once held, leaves an echo. That echo reached the reporter one evening in the form of a voicemail. No caller ID. Just a voice, older, strained. "You're asking the wrong question," the voice said. "It's not who did it. It's who decided what doing it would mean." The line went dead. She replayed the message again and again, hearing not menace but exhaustion. The sound of someone who had lived with knowledge too heavy to carry comfortably. She followed that lead the only way she could, by tracing decisions, approvals, timing. She mapped out who had been where and when, who had the authority to redirect resources, who benefited not from the crime itself, but from its containment. The pattern tightened. At the center wasn't motive in the traditional sense. Not money, not passion, not even cruelty. It was protection, reputation, the belief that preserving order justified distortion, that shielding the town from scandal was more important than exposing the truth. A kind of moral arithmetic. The family felt the weight of this more than anyone. Her mother stopped correcting people when they said the case was solved. She didn't have the energy anymore. Her father, quieter than ever, began sorting through boxes in the basement, letters, photos, school papers. He wasn't looking for answers. He was preparing. For what, he wasn't sure. One night, he found a cassette tape he didn't remember labeling. His handwriting on the side was shaky, rushed. A date. A time. 2 days after his daughter vanished. He played it. It was her voice. Not a message, not a goodbye. Just a recording, ambient sound, muffled conversation, the clink of dishes. Then her voice, distant but clear enough. "I'll be right back," she said. "It's someone I know." The tape cut off abruptly. He sat in the dark, the recorder still warm in his hands, understanding dawning slowly, painfully. She hadn't planned to disappear. She hadn't trusted a stranger. She had trusted familiarity. The tape had been given to him by a friend years earlier, he realized now, someone who had found it accidentally while recording over old material, then panicked and handed it off without explanation. At the time, he'd been too overwhelmed to question it. He'd put it away. Tried to survive. Now, decades later, it sounded like an accusation. The family turned the tape over to investigators. It was logged, analyzed, declared inconclusive. The source couldn't be verified. The recording device was common. The voice, though similar, couldn't be definitively identified. Still, it changed the tone. Because it aligned too closely with what others were finally admitting, that she had gone with someone she recognized. That the danger hadn't announced itself as danger. The town absorbed this quietly. No protests, no marches, just a slow recalibration of belief. People revisited old interactions, wondering how well they had really known those around them. Wondering what they themselves might have ignored if circumstances had demanded it. The investigators prepared their final report. This time, they were more direct. They couldn't name a perpetrator with certainty. They couldn't undo decades of decisions. But they could say this: the case had not been conclusively solved. The official closure had been premature. Significant questions remained. They submitted it. It stalled. Weeks passed. Then months. No response. No acknowledgement. The system did what it did best when faced with complexity. It waited. The reporter published again, this time focusing not on accusation, but on absence. On the unanswered questions that refused to be resolved by declarations. The piece was quieter. Heavier. It didn't demand justice. It demanded honesty. The reaction was muted but lasting. People didn't argue as much anymore. They listened. They thought. They carried the discomfort with them into daily life, into conversations with their children, into the way they understood authority. The cold case remained closed in the record. In reality, it had transformed into something else entirely. Not an investigation. A reckoning. And reckoning, once begun, doesn't end neatly. It lingers. It reshapes. It waits for the moment when silence becomes more dangerous than truth. That moment was approaching. Slowly. Inevitably. The first lawsuit wasn't about the murder. It was about the lie. A civil complaint, filed quietly in a neighboring county, alleged intentional misrepresentation by officials involved in the original investigation and the later closure announcement. The plaintiffs weren't seeking a conviction. They were seeking records, internal communications, unredacted logs, anything that might explain how certainty had been manufactured where doubt should have remained. The filing cracked something open. Suddenly, documents long considered untouchable were subject to disclosure. Emails surfaced. Memos. Handwritten notes scanned into databases and forgotten. The language wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It revealed mindset. Keep this contained. No benefit to pursuing this angle. Town stability must be considered. The phrase appeared again and again, phrased differently but unmistakable in intent. Stability over truth. Order over accuracy. Depositions followed. Former officials, older now, sat across from attorneys who weren't interested in protecting reputations. They were asked about decisions they had once made casually. Why this lead was dropped. Why that evidence wasn't logged. Why the quarry search ended when it did. Some answers were evasive. Others were surprisingly candid. One man admitted that reopening the quarry would have caused problems. When pressed to clarify, he paused, then said, "People would have asked why we stopped looking there in the first place." Another acknowledged that the closure announcement had been framed to sound more definitive than the evidence supported. The public needed an ending, he said. Endings matter. The court transcripts didn't name a killer. But they told a story of risk management masquerading as justice, of a system more afraid of doubt than of error, of a community protected from scandal at the cost of certainty. The reporter attended every session. She took notes the way she always had, careful, precise, aware that history often reveals itself in tone rather than confession. In one deposition, a former supervisor was asked whether pressure had been applied to limit the scope of the investigation. He laughed. "Pressure," he said. "No. Guidance." That word again. Guidance, it turned out, had come from above. From offices that never appeared in press conferences. From people whose careers depended on smooth narratives, not messy truth. The case had become a liability the moment it threatened to implicate someone untouchable. So it had been steered. The civil case gained traction. Media attention returned, but this time it was different. Less sensational. More surgical. Headlines focused on accountability rather than mystery. The disappearance was no longer just a tragedy. It was evidence. The family watched with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. They had waited decades for answers. Now they were waiting for honesty. The difference mattered. Her mother spoke once, at a small gathering organized by advocates for unresolved cases. She didn't accuse anyone. She didn't demand punishment. She said something simpler, more devastating. "They told us it was over," she said. "But it never was. It was just taken away from us." As proceedings continued, one final detail emerged, buried in a batch of late disclosed documents. A report, stamped but never signed, dated months after the disappearance. It summarized a meeting between local and state officials. The subject line was brief. Risk assessment. The report outlined scenarios. What would happen if certain information became public? How trust might erode. How cooperation could suffer. It recommended narrative consolidation, aligning public messaging with a single, manageable explanation. The language was clinical. The implications were not. This wasn't about solving a crime. It was about managing fallout. When the document became public, reaction was swift and unambiguous. Outrage replaced doubt. The idea that the case had been closed for the community's benefit collapsed under its own weight. Calls for a criminal review followed. Not of the disappearance, but of the investigation itself. That was the moment everything shifted. Because once attention turned toward process, toward decision-making, the question of who had killed the missing woman became almost secondary. The larger issue was how easily truth could be reshaped, and how often it had been. The state announced the formation of a special oversight committee. Its mandate was narrow, its timeline vague, but its existence was an admission. The cold case wasn't just unresolved. It was compromised. The reporter wrote her final piece on the case not as a narrative, but as a ledger. A list of decisions, of alternatives not taken, of questions answered too quickly and others not answered at all. She ended it without conclusions. She didn't need them. The town read it slowly. People recognized themselves in its margins, in the choices they had accepted, the doubts they had buried. The story was no longer about a single night on a dark road. It was about decades of quiet agreement. And then, unexpectedly, something else happened. A man came forward. He wasn't a whistleblower. He wasn't a hero. He was a former employee at the private facility where the second vehicle had been held briefly all those years ago. He was old, sick, tired of remembering. He said there had been something in the trunk. Not a body. Not evidence of murder. Something simpler. Something damning in a different way. A woman's shoe. It hadn't been logged. It hadn't been photographed. He'd been told to remove it before the vehicle was returned. Why? He was asked. Because it didn't fit, he said. Fit what? The story. The admission didn't solve the case. It destroyed the illusion that it ever had been. And once that illusion was gone, the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant. as if the truth, long held back by careful hands and calculated restraint, was finally preparing to say the part no one could control anymore. The Oversight Committee called it Phase 1, a careful phrase, meant to suggest order, progress, control. In practice, it meant reopening doors that had been closed so long the hinges screamed when they moved. Subpoenas went out. Old supervisors were called back into rooms they had hoped never to see again. The language of the investigation shifted from what happened to who decided what would be said. That distinction unsettled everyone. Because crimes have perpetrators, decisions have fingerprints, the shoe became the fulcrum. Not because it proved violence, but because it proved presence. It proved proximity. It proved that the second vehicle hadn't just passed through the story, it had intersected with it in a way no official narrative could absorb. The shoe was never recovered. No one claimed to know where it went. The facility worker said he'd been told to discard it. How, where, when, those details were lost to time. But its existence was enough to collapse one of the central assumptions of the closed case, that the victim had never been in that vehicle. Now, that assumption was untenable. Investigators re-examined early witness statements with that in mind. Suddenly, phrases that had been minimized took on new meaning. She wasn't alone. I saw her get in. It looked like she knew him. Those statements had been categorized as unreliable, emotional, confused. Now they looked inconvenient. The committee's internal report, leaked before it was finalized, used language that stopped just short of accusation. It spoke of systemic bias toward narrative simplicity and institutional reluctance to pursue leads that intersected with positions of authority. Positions of authority. That phrase landed hard. Because by then, the name everyone had avoided for years was circulating openly. Not shouted. Not printed in headlines. Just spoken plainly, in full sentences, without euphemism. People didn't ask if he'd been involved anymore. They asked how much. The man had been powerful in his time. Not untouchable, but close enough that consequences bent around him. He had known how to frame concerns as overreactions, how to label curiosity as recklessness. He had understood something fundamental about systems, that they protect continuity above all else. And continuity had been preserved. The Oversight Committee requested testimony from his former colleague. Some cooperated fully. Others hedged. A few invoked memory loss so total it bordered on performance. But one testimony stood out. A former administrator, now in assisted living, spoke slowly, carefully, as if measuring each word against the weight of years. He described a meeting held shortly after the disappearance, a meeting not listed on any official calendar. He said the tone had been urgent, not investigative. There was concern about escalation, he said, about where certain lines of inquiry could lead. When asked who expressed that concern, he paused. Everyone, he said, after it was made clear. Clear by whom? He didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. The committee also revisited the closure announcement itself. Drafts surfaced. Early versions were cautious, provisional. Later ones were definitive, absolute. The language had been sharpened deliberately, edited by people far removed from the evidence itself. One margin note, written in a different hand, read simply, "This needs to end." That note became public. And when it did, the idea that the case had been closed for justice collapsed entirely. What remained was something far more disturbing, the realization that truth had been negotiable. The family watched all of this with a strange detachment. They had passed through anger, hope, despair, and back again too many times to feel surprise anymore. What they felt now was resolve. Her father requested one thing from the committee: a public acknowledgement. Not of guilt, not of culpability, just acknowledgement that the investigation had failed her, not through incompetence, but through choice. It took weeks, deliberations, language revisions, legal caution, but eventually a statement was released. It did not name a killer. It did not reopen the case officially. It said this. The conclusion announced decades later could not be supported with certainty. The investigation had been influenced by non-evidentiary considerations. The family had not been given the full truth. It was the closest thing to an apology the system could produce. The town absorbed it quietly. There were no protests, no celebrations, just a low, collective exhale. The kind that comes when something long suspected is finally confirmed, even if confirmation brings no comfort. The reporter stood in the same diner where the woman had last been seen, watching snow fall outside the window. She thought about how many times this place had appeared in stories, as a beginning, as a memory, as a symbol of normalcy interrupted. Now it felt different. Not haunted, just honest. She filed one more piece. Not an exposé. Not an indictment. A reflection on what happens when institutions confuse closure with resolution. When they mistake silence for peace. She ended it with a line from the oversight statement, unembellished. The absence of certainty does not justify the manufacture of it. The case file was amended. Not reopened. Amended. A footnote added to decades of paperwork, acknowledging doubt where certainty had once been declared. The suspect named in the closure announcement remained, officially, the answer. But now his name carried an asterisk, an admission that he might have been convenient rather than correct. As for the man whose shadow had shaped everything, there would be no charges. No trial. No reckoning in a courtroom. Time had taken that possibility away. But time had not taken memory. People spoke his name now without fear. Not with rage. With clarity. They talked about how power works, how easily it persuades others to look away, how often it succeeds. And somewhere in that shift, something fragile but real emerged. Not justice. Truth adjacent. Enough to change how the town told the story to itself. Enough to ensure that when people said her name now, they did so without the false comfort of an ending. The road where her car had been found remained unmarked. No plaque. No sign. Just asphalt stretching into fields, indistinguishable from 100 other roads. But those who knew looked at it differently. They understood now that the cold case hadn't been closed. It had been sealed. And seals, once broken, never quite hold the same way again. The story was nearing its end. Not because everything had been answered, but because there was nothing left that could be hidden. The final hearing was scheduled without ceremony. No cameras allowed. No live updates. Just a date on a public docket that most people wouldn't notice unless they were already looking. Phase 2, they called it, a review of accountability measures. Not consequences. Measures. Language mattered. It always had. Inside the room, the oversight committee listened to summaries they already knew by heart. Timelines. Decision trees. Flowcharts that reduced decades of human pain into arrows and bullet points. It was all very clean. Very controlled. And yet, beneath it, something raw pressed upward, refusing to be fully contained. They spoke about precedent. About how far responsibility could extend before it became destabilizing. About what it would mean to formally acknowledge that a powerful figure had shaped an investigation away from truth, not through force but through influence. One member asked the question no one had wanted to ask until now. If we say it plainly, she said, what does that do? The answer came quietly. It changes everything that comes after. Because admitting this wasn't just about one case. It was about setting a line. About declaring that narrative management was not an acceptable substitute for justice. About acknowledging that stability built on omission was still damage. The committee recessed, deliberated, argued. Words like liability and institutional trust collided with words like ethics and harm. No one disputed the facts anymore. They disputed the fallout. Outside that room, the town waited. Not anxiously. Not desperately. Just attentively. People had learned patience the hard way. They understood that answers, when they came, rarely looked like relief. The family didn't attend. They had done enough waiting in rooms that promised resolution. This time, they stayed home, together, surrounded by familiar things. Photos, furniture worn smooth by years of use, the quiet persistence of ordinary life. Her mother held the map again, tracing the faded red circle with her finger. She no longer believed it would lead to remains. She believed it marked intention. A meeting point. A place chosen for reasons she would never fully know. That, too, was an answer of sorts. When the committee returned, the chair read from a prepared statement. The words were precise, careful, impossible to misinterpret if you listened closely. They acknowledged that the investigation had been improperly influenced, that decisions had been made to limit exposure rather than pursue certainty, that the public announcement of closure had exceeded what the evidence could responsibly support. They stopped short of naming names. But they named the act, a breach of public trust. The recommendation followed: mandatory reforms, oversight mechanisms, external review requirements for cold case closures, transparency provisions that made future containment harder. No punishment, no prosecutions, but a line had been drawn. The statement was released that afternoon. It spread quickly, but not explosively. There were no breaking news graphics, no outraged panels. The story had outgrown that phase. It settled instead into a long, quiet reckoning. Editorials followed. Some praised the restraint. Others condemned the lack of consequences. A few argued that reopening wounds served no one. But something fundamental had shifted. The official record now acknowledged what the town had come to understand, that the story it had been told was incomplete by design. The reporter wrote her last piece that night. She didn't frame it as an ending. She framed it as a correction. She wrote about the danger of mistaking authority for accuracy, about how easy it is for communities to accept certainty when uncertainty feels unbearable, about how truth doesn't always arrive as revelation, sometimes it arrives as permission to doubt what you were told. She never speculated about the exact moment the crime occurred. She never described the violence that might have taken place. She didn't need to. The case had moved beyond that. This wasn't about how she died. It was about how the truth had been handled after. The article ended with a single image: a road at dusk, empty, unremarkable, stretching forward without signposts. A reminder that some paths don't lead to answers, only to better questions. The town read it and nodded, quietly. In the weeks that followed, changes were subtle but real. Training sessions, policy updates, new language in official statements, cautious where once it had been absolute. Young officers were taught not just procedure, but humility. The old guard faded further into history. As for the case itself, it remained unresolved in the way that mattered most. No name replaced the convenient suspect. No final theory emerged to satisfy everyone. The truth stayed fragmented, its sharp edges dulled but still present. And somehow that was enough. Not because it healed the loss, but because it restored something else: the right to say we don't know without shame. The right to acknowledge that certainty had been claimed prematurely. The right to remember her without a false ending attached. On the anniversary of her disappearance, the family returned to the diner one last time. They sat in the same booth, ordered the same coffee, said very little. At the end of the meal, her father placed the map on the table, flattened it carefully, then folded it again. He didn't leave it behind. He never would. But he no longer needed it to lead anywhere. Outside, traffic passed. Life continued. The town moved forward, changed in ways that wouldn't make headlines but would shape how stories were told from now on. The cold case was still cold, still unresolved, but it was no longer closed. And in that space, between certainty and silence, something honest finally had room to exist. The story had one part left to tell. Not about answers, but about what remains when answers never come. Years later, people would struggle to remember exactly when the story stopped feeling like news and started feeling like memory. There was no final broadcast, no anniversary special, No definitive line drawn beneath the case in bold type. It simply receded from the front pages, slipping into that quiet space where unresolved things live. Not forgotten, but no longer chased with urgency. And yet it lingered. It lingered in the way the town spoke more carefully now, pausing before declaring certainty. In the way officials avoided the word closed unless they truly meant it. In the way young reporters were taught this case as a cautionary tale, not of violence alone, but of narrative, of how easily truth can be bent when closure is treated as a public service. The road where she was last seen remained unchanged. Same cracked asphalt, same narrow shoulder, no marker, no sign. Drivers passed without slowing, unaware that this stretch of nothing had once carried the weight of an entire community's unanswered questions. But some still slowed. Not because they expected to see anything, but because habits once formed around grief take time to fade. Her name surfaced occasionally. In classrooms, in ethics seminars, in quiet conversations between detectives who understood that not knowing was sometimes the most honest conclusion an investigation could reach. No one claimed to know what truly happened anymore. The theories had exhausted themselves, each one eventually collapsing under the same pressure, missing time, missing evidence, missing certainty. What remained were fragments. A sighting that couldn't be verified. A phone call that might have meant nothing. A decision made behind closed doors that shaped everything afterward. And the understanding that the damage hadn't ended with her disappearance. The real aftershock had come later, when the truth was simplified, compressed, packaged into something easier to live with. When complexity was traded for calm. When doubt was treated as a threat instead of a responsibility. The family aged quietly. Milestones came and went without her. Holidays adjusted themselves around absence until the absence felt almost structural, like a beam removed from a house that somehow still stood. They stopped giving interviews. Not out of bitterness, but exhaustion. There was nothing left to explain. They knew now that resolution was not something the world could grant them. Only honesty could. And honesty, imperfect as it was, had finally arrived, not in the form of answers, but in the refusal to pretend. The reporter moved on to other stories. Bigger ones. Louder ones. But this case followed her in subtle ways. She asked harder questions. She pushed back against premature conclusions. She learned to recognize when certainty was being used as camouflage. Every so often, she'd revisit the old note. Not to solve anything, just to remember how easily a story could be shaped, and how dangerous that shaping could become when left unchecked. The town never erected a memorial. There was talk of one. A plaque. A bench. Something symbolic. But it never felt right. Anything permanent felt like claiming ownership over a story that had never belonged to anyone but her. Instead, remembrance stayed informal. Private. A shared understanding passed quietly between people who'd lived through it. And maybe that was fitting. Because this case was never about spectacle. It was about what happens when silence is dressed up as certainty. When influence replaces investigation. When communities are told to move on before they're ready, and do so because they trust the voice telling them to. The official files still sit on a shelf somewhere, labeled and indexed. The words case status no longer carry a definitive answer. Just context. Just history. Cold case. Unresolved. And that is where the story finally rests. Not with a name. Not with a confession. Not with a revelation that ties every loose end into a clean, consumable conclusion. But with an absence that remains honest. A reminder that some truths do not arrive dramatically. They arrive slowly, painfully, through the dismantling of what we thought we knew. The killer was never revealed. The ending was never given. And yet, the most important lie was finally stripped away. In a small town in Iowa, the case stopped pretending to be solved. And in that quiet admission, the story became something rarer than closure. It became real. There was no announcement that this would be the last time the case resurfaced. It didn't arrive as a headline. It didn't interrupt programming. It came quietly, folded into a routine audit of archived investigations, buried several layers deep in a digital system that only a few people still knew how to navigate. A notation, a timestamp, a subtle change in classification language that most would never notice unless they were looking for it, and almost no one was anymore. But someone was. The entry didn't add evidence. It didn't introduce a suspect. It didn't reopen the investigation in any formal sense. It simply removed a word that had been sitting there for decades, unchallenged, unquestioned, heavy with implication. Solve. The word disappeared. In its place, something colder, more honest, less comforting, undetermined. No press release followed. No public correction. The system updated, the record shifted, and the machinery moved on. But the change mattered because records are not just storage. They are memory. And memory, once adjusted, has a way of rippling outward. A retired clerk noticed it first. Then a legal researcher cross-referencing old cases. Then a graduate student, digging through unresolved disappearances for a thesis on investigative language. Each of them paused at the same place, feeling the same quiet friction, the sensation of something once declared finished now admitting that it never truly was. The case had not been reopened. But it had been released. Released from the false certainty that had weighed it down. Released from the obligation to make sense when sense had never been earned. Released into that rare category of stories allowed to exist without explanation. The town didn't hear about the update for months. When it did surface, it traveled the way these things always do now, not through official channels, but through a screenshot shared privately, then forwarded again, accompanied by a single line of text. They changed it. No one asked who they were. It didn't matter. What mattered was the acknowledgement, however late, however quiet, that the ending everyone had been handed was never legitimate. Some people felt anger. Others felt vindication. Most felt something harder to name. A strange blend of relief and grief, tangled together. Because to admit uncertainty after so long was to reopen a door many had already learned to live with closed. The family heard last. They always did. This time, the news arrived without ceremony. A call. A message. A forwarded image of a screen with highlighted text. No apology attached. No explanation. Just the fact itself, standing alone. Her mother stared at it for a long time. Then she set the phone down and went back to the window. Nothing outside had changed. The same street. The same afternoon light. The same quiet movement of ordinary life continuing, indifferent to record updates and administrative corrections. But something inside her shifted, not dramatically, not violently. Just enough to feel. For years, she had carried two kinds of pain. The first was loss. The second was being told that the loss had an explanation she never believed. One was inevitable. The other was imposed. Now, at last, the imposed pain loosened its grip. No answers appeared. No images sharpened. No memories rearranged themselves into clarity. But the pressure to accept an ending that felt wrong finally lifted. That mattered more than anyone outside the family would ever understand. The case never returned to active investigation. Evidence was too thin. Time had erased too much. The people involved were gone, unreachable, or protected by the same silence that had shaped the story from the beginning. But the change in status altered how the case lived in the world. It stopped being cited as an example of resolution. It stopped being used as proof that persistence always pays off. It stopped serving as a convenient conclusion in presentations and training manuals. Instead, it became something else. A warning. A reminder that closure declared is not the same as closure earned. That institutional confidence can harden into fiction if left unchecked. That the absence of answers does not justify the invention of them. The reporter saw the update months later, long after she'd stopped actively following the case. It appeared in a database she rarely opened now, a relic from an earlier chapter of her career. She recognized the file number immediately. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt confirmation. Confirmation that the unease she'd carried had been warranted. That the story she'd resisted simplifying had, in fact, resisted simplification all along. That the discomfort of saying we don't know had been the most honest position available from the beginning. She never wrote another article about it. She didn't need to. The correction existed. Quiet. Uncelebrated, but real. And that was enough. Years passed. New cases captured attention. New tragedies demanded narrative, demanded clarity, demanded resolution. The machinery kept turning, still imperfect, still vulnerable to the same pressures that had shaped this case so many years ago. But somewhere in the system, a small change persisted. A missing word. A refusal to lie. The town aged. Storefronts changed hands. Streets were repaved. Children who had not been born when she disappeared grew up without ever hearing her name unless they went looking for it. And yet the story remained, not loud, not present, but embedded. In caution, in hesitation, in the careful phrasing of officials who had learned, however belatedly, that certainty carries weight. On quiet nights, when the diner closed early and the road outside lay empty, there were still moments when someone would think of her. Not as a mystery to be solved, not as a case to be closed, but as a life interrupted, a question unanswered, a truth mishandled. The cold case never warmed. It never yielded a confession or a final piece of evidence that made everything align. It never transformed into the kind of story that rewards patience with revelation. Instead, it did something rarer. It taught restraint. It taught the cost of pretending. It taught that silence can be less harmful than certainty when certainty is false. Taught that some stories do not end, they simply stop being forced into shapes that don't fit. The record now reflects that. Undetermined, unresolved, still open, not in practice but in principle. And in that space, that narrow, uncomfortable space where answers do not arrive, the story finally rests without distortion. No killer revealed. No neat conclusion. Just the truth, as incomplete as it always was, standing on its own at last. A cold case that refused to stay closed. And a town that, finally, learned to live with the honesty of not knowing. Long after the databases were updated and the language corrected, after the last clerk logged out and the last memo faded into archival silence, the case continued to exist in a place no system could touch. It lived in the pauses. In the way certain questions were no longer answered too quickly. In the hesitation before a spokesperson used the word solve. In the subtle shift of tone when old cases were discussed, less triumphant, more careful, as if everyone had learned that certainty could bruise as deeply as ignorance. Time did what it always does. It softened details without erasing them. Faces blurred. Exact dates slipped. But the emotional outline of the story remained sharp, etched into the collective memory of a town that had once believed it needed an ending more than it needed the truth. New officers came and went. They learned the case not as an active file, but as a lesson. It was mentioned quietly during training, usually near the end, when the slides were gone and the room was tired. A senior voice would lower, just slightly, and say this was the one that taught them not to rush the last chapter. Not because rushing had failed, but because rushing had succeeded too well. It had delivered calm. It had delivered closure. It had delivered relief. And all of it had been hollow. The family marked time differently now. Not by anniversaries, not by headlines, but by absence woven into routine. A chair never filled. A voice never heard in conversation. The shape of a life that should have unfolded but didn't. They no longer waited for calls. They no longer scanned faces. They understood, finally, that waiting had been part of the harm, imposed by a system that promised answers while quietly removing the possibility of them. Letting go of that expectation was not surrender. It was survival. Sometimes, someone new would stumble onto the story. A podcaster, a writer, a student convinced that fresh eyes could uncover what others had missed. They would reach out politely, carefully, asking for interviews, for memories, for permission. Most were declined. Not out of secrecy, out of exhaustion, because the story no longer needed retelling. It needed respect, and respect, in this case, meant knowing when to stop searching for a conclusion that did not exist. The town understood that now. It showed in small ways. In how people corrected each other gently when old myths resurfaced. In how no one repeated the convenient suspect's name anymore. In how the story, when told at all, ended not with certainty but with an open breath, a recognition that something was missing and always would be. The diner eventually changed ownership. New paint, new menu, same counter, same windows facing the road. People still sat in the booth near the back without realizing why it felt familiar. History has a way of embedding itself in places even when names are forgotten. On some evenings, when the light fell just right, the road outside looked exactly as it had on the night she vanished. Empty. Ordinary. Deceptively calm. A reminder that the most unsettling events rarely announce themselves. They just happen. And then the stories begin. This one never found a clean ending. It resisted structure. It slipped through every attempt to pin it down. And in doing so, it exposed something uncomfortable, not about crime, but about us. About how badly we want answers. About how easily we accept them when they are offered with confidence. About how rarely we stop to ask who benefits from closure, and who pays for it. In the end, the case became something quieter than a mystery. It became a mirror, held up to a system that learned, too late but not too late to matter, that truth is not a performance and resolution is not a right. Some stories end with justice. Some end with revelation. This one ended with restraint, with the refusal to pretend. With a town, a family, and a record that finally agreed on the same difficult sentence. We don't know what happened. And we won't invent an answer just to feel better. The cold case remains. Not as a failure, but as a boundary. A line drawn between honesty and illusion. Between silence and certainty. Between what can be proven and what must be left unanswered. And somewhere beyond records and reforms, beyond headlines and hearings, a life interrupted remains exactly that, not a symbol, not a lesson, but a human absence that no conclusion can repair. The story does not close. It fades. And in that fading, it tells the truth at last. Eventually, even the echo of the story learned how to be quiet. Not erased. Not denied. Just absorbed into the background of a town that had carried it for so long it no longer needed to speak its name out loud. The case stopped being referenced in meetings. Stopped being footnoted in lectures. Stopped being pulled forward whenever someone needed an example. It didn't disappear. It settled. The files remained where they were, untouched, intact, heavy with years. Dust collected on the boxes. Digital folders slept behind passwords that hadn't been changed in a decade. Nothing new was added. Nothing was taken away. The story existed in a state of suspension, neither moving forward nor closing in on itself. And that suspension became its final form. People who had once been at the center of it aged out of relevance, retired, moved away, passed on. With them went certain memories, certain conversations that had never been recorded, certain looks exchanged in hallways that explained more than any document ever could. Those details were gone now. All that remained was what could be proven, and the long list of things that could not. The town learned to live with that imbalance. It learned that some questions do not shrink with time. They simply change texture. They become less sharp, less urgent, but no less real. They sit beneath daily life like a low, constant hum, only audible when everything else goes quiet. On nights like that, the road still held its shape, a line through darkness, a place where nothing looked wrong and everything once had been. People drove it without thinking, unaware that history sometimes chooses the most unremarkable settings to leave its deepest mark. Nothing marked the spot. Nothing ever would. The family never asked for anything to be named after her. No scholarship, no foundation, no plaque. They understood now that memorials can sometimes feel like substitutes, offered when answers cannot be. They didn't want substitutes. They wanted honesty. And honesty, at last, was what they had been given, incomplete, uncomfortable, but real. In private moments, her mother still spoke to her. Not out loud, just in thought. Small updates, small acknowledgments, the kind that don't expect a response. That ritual didn't change when the case language changed. It never depended on records. It depended on memory. The reporter, older now, occasionally met young journalists who spoke with excitement about uncovering hidden truths, about exposing injustice, about delivering revelations. She listened. She smiled. And sometimes, when the moment felt right, she told them about a case that taught her the most important lesson of her career. Not how to break a story, but how to stop one from being broken. She told them that restraint can be an act of courage. That saying we don't know can be more powerful than presenting a theory wrapped in confidence. That the pressure to conclude is often stronger than the evidence itself. Some understood immediately. Others would learn later. That was fine. The case no longer needed champions. It needed caretakers of its truth, people willing to leave it as it was rather than forcing it into a shape that satisfied expectation. The system, imperfect as it remained, absorbed the lesson slowly. Procedures shifted. Language softened. Absolutes were replaced with probabilities. Certainty was treated with suspicion rather than applause. It wasn't justice, but it was progress. Years from now, someone might stumble across the file again, might feel the pull of the unanswered, might believe they could be the one to finally solve it. And maybe they would try. But the story would greet them the same way it greeted everyone who came after the noise faded, without promise, without drama, without reward. Just facts. Just gaps. Just the quiet insistence that some truths do not reveal themselves, no matter how long you wait. The cold case endures not because it demands attention, but because it resists closure. Because it stands as proof that certainty can be the most dangerous fiction of all. And in a small town in Iowa, where life continues in ordinary ways, that lesson remains, not written on a sign, not spoken in ceremonies, but carried quietly by those who remember what it felt like to be told the story was over when it wasn't. The case does not move forward. It does not move back. It simply exists, unsolved, unfinished, and finally, honestly so. By the time enough years had passed that the case no longer belonged to any living authority, it had become something closer to weather than history. Present, unavoidable, no longer debated. It shaped decisions quietly. It influenced tone. It lingered in the background of conversations that never named it directly. When officials spoke now, they spoke slower. When conclusions were offered, they came with conditions attached. Somewhere deep in the institutional memory, this story had taught caution in a way no policy manual ever could. Because it had shown what happens when certainty outpaces truth. The file number still existed. Occasionally, it was accessed by someone who didn't yet understand its weight. An intern, a junior analyst, a researcher chasing patterns across decades. They'd open it expecting drama, expecting revelation, expecting the moment where everything snapped into focus. They never found it. What they found instead was absence made official. Reports that ended in qualifiers. Memos that circled without landing. Language that grew more careful as time went on, as if even the words themselves were learning restraint. Some closed the file frustrated. Others closed it changed. The town barely noticed anymore when her name surfaced. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been integrated. Like an old scar, no longer painful, but always there, altering the shape of things around it. People who had once argued fiercely about theories now corrected misinformation without emotion. They didn't speculate. They didn't defend. They simply stated what was known and what was not, and let silence do the rest. That, too, was a kind of progress. The family lived on. Quietly. Fully. They did not define themselves by the case anymore, even though it had defined so much of their past. Grief had learned to coexist with ordinary joy. Laughter returned, not as betrayal, but as survival. They understood now that closure is a story we tell ourselves, and that sometimes the bravest thing is to stop telling it. On certain dates, memory sharpened. Not into spectacle, not into ritual, but into reflection. A pause. A breath. A moment of inward acknowledgement that needed no audience. That was enough. No one tried to reopen the case again. Not officially. Not seriously. There was nothing left to pursue without inventing something new, and invention had already done enough harm. The cold case remained where it belonged. Not solved. Not ignored. Just respected for what it was. In time, the phrase closed case began to carry a different weight in the culture. It was no longer a promise. It was a claim, one that demanded evidence, humility, and the willingness to revisit if proven wrong. That shift didn't make headlines. But it mattered. Because it meant that somewhere, in some future investigation, someone would hesitate before declaring victory. Someone would remember this story, not in detail, not by name, but by feeling. The discomfort, the doubt, the cost of being wrong with confidence, and that hesitation might spare another family years of imposed certainty. That was the legacy. Not justice, not resolution, but restraint passed forward. The road still runs through town. The diner still opens its doors. Life continues in the ways it always does, indifferent to the stories layered beneath it. Yet beneath that normalcy, the truth remains unchanged. A woman disappeared. An answer never came. A community learned that pretending otherwise was the greater crime. The case does not end. It does not conclude. It endures as a quiet warning that truth, when mishandled, does not disappear. It waits, and waits, and waits. At some point, the story stopped asking to be told. It didn't resist retelling. It simply no longer demanded it. The urgency that once clung to every mention dissolved into something steadier, heavier, like ground that had finally settled after years of disturbance. What remained was not silence, but balance, a fragile understanding that some narratives are not meant to be carried forever at full volume. The case reached a strange kind of stillness. Not peace, not acceptance, stillness. The files stayed where they were, occasionally referenced, rarely touched, no longer a symbol of failure or hope, but of limits. The limits of evidence, the limits of memory, the limits of authority when confronted with time. People who encountered it late often misunderstood that stillness. They mistook it for apathy, for resignation. But those who had lived through the noise knew better. This was not forgetting. This was restraint earned the hard way. The town changed faces again. New families moved in. Old houses were renovated. Children rode bikes past places that once carried fear without ever sensing it. History does not announce itself to those who inherit it, it whispers, selectively, only when needed. And sometimes, not at all. The case lingered in small institutional habit, in the extra paragraph added to reports, in the way uncertainty was allowed space instead of being edited out, in the refusal to rush toward narrative symmetry when reality offered none. It had become a quiet instructor, teaching without speaking. The family reached a point where the absence no longer defined their days. It remained, always would, but it no longer dictated the shape of every moment. They had learned that memory can exist without pursuit, that love does not require resolution to endure. Her name was spoken less often now, but when it was, it carried no argument. No theories followed. No speculation bloomed around it. Just acknowledgement. That, in itself, was a form of care. The reporter, nearing the end of her career, kept one habit from her earlier years. Whenever a case seemed too clean, too complete, too perfectly framed, she paused. She read between lines. She asked what had been left out for the sake of order. Sometimes she found nothing. Sometimes she found the beginning of another story that would never fully end. And when younger colleagues asked how she learned to recognize that feeling, she never cited awards or investigations. She spoke instead about a cold case in a small town, one that taught her the danger of believing an ending simply because it was offered. The system never fully corrected itself. Systems rarely do. But it bent slightly away from certainty, away from performance, toward something closer to integrity. That bend mattered, because it acknowledged that truth is not obligated to arrive on schedule, that justice is not guaranteed by declaration, that saying we don't know is sometimes the only ethical position left. The road taught nothing. The diner remembered nothing. Places do not carry truth the way people hope they do. People do. And the people who carried this story learned, slowly, painfully, that the most responsible thing they could do was stop forcing it forward. The cold case did not resolve. It did not warm. It did not transform into a parable with a lesson neatly underlined. It remained what it had always been, a disappearance surrounded by choices, silences, and the long shadow of certainty claimed too soon. Time passed. Not dramatically, just faithfully. And with each year, the case loosened its grip, not because answers arrived, but because honesty finally had. The record stayed open in principle. The truth stayed incomplete. And the story, at last, was allowed to rest, not because it was finished, but because it was no longer being asked to pretend it was. That is how it ends. Not with revelation. Not with closure. But with a quiet understanding that some stories are most truthful when we stop trying to close them at all. Morning comes without ceremony. The first trains of the day cut through the tunnels with purpose, headlights carving certainty into darkness that has learned to yield. The city wakes in layers, coffee machines hissing, storefront gates rattling up, footsteps finding rhythm again. Whatever lingered overnight dissolves into routine, not erased, just redistributed. A station agent unlocks a booth and powers on the console. Screens glow. Numbers populate. He adjusts his chair, checks the radio, nods to no one in particular. The system is awake. So is he. He doesn't think about history. He thinks about flow. On the platform, a woman ties her shoe, fingers cold, not pulled tight. A man offers his seat without comment. A kid watches the tunnel with awe, waiting for the wind that means a train is coming. These are small exchanges, frictionless, barely visible. They are the city's real architecture. Somewhere along the line, a camera hums quietly, its lens catching what it can and missing what it must. Somewhere else, a light gets replaced before it fails. A report is filed before it matters. A question is asked before silence sets in. None of it will trend. All of it counts. The station that once anchored a headline blends back into the map. Renovations finish. Posters peel. New ads promise urgency about things that won't last. The angles remain. So does the understanding, unspoken, shared by those who know how close ordinary moments can drift to the edge. A commuter pauses, sensing it. Not fear. Awareness. He steps a half-pace back as the train arrives. The doors open. He boards. The choice vanishes into motion. That's the legacy. Not a cautionary tale delivered in hindsight. Not a plaque that freezes meaning in place. A reflex passed hand to hand, learned without instruction, renewed every time someone decides to pay attention when it would be easier not to. The subway runs. The city carries on. And beneath the noise, beneath the schedules and the screens, something steadier hums, a collective memory transformed into practice, a story no longer told aloud because it doesn't need to be. It's moving now. So is everyone else.